Hi, everyone. I want to take a moment today to look at this idea of structure and character, as you can see here in my terrible handwriting at the top. A lot of this discussion comes from a book by John Truby called The Anatomy of Story. So, a lot of my discussions are going to come with modification from his book. So, it's a really good book. If you have a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. Some of the stuff he goes into has more to do with screenwriting than with fiction, but the basic core is how do we build a compelling story? How do we create interesting characters, et cetera, et cetera. So, what I want to do is set out a generic story structure. Now, I'm going to give you a different one later, okay? But this is a way of kind of approaching both structure in the story and how to build a character, okay? Because all of these, 1 through 7 right here, these all relate very closely to character, okay? Um, so when we get to this idea, number one, of weakness and need, this is something central to building an interesting character, okay? We all have varying degrees of weaknesses and needs that in our own normal lives. The trick with fiction is that you're actually stripping out a lot of the day-to-day stuff, okay? You're trying to focus down on one real need, one real weakness inherent to the character. As you all know, as human beings, we are full of weaknesses. We are full of different needs, okay? In a short story, because we have a very limited page number, you want to establish the character's weaknesses and needs as clearly and as early as possible. Now, I'm going to use the term hero interchangeably with point of view character, protagonist, character in general. Okay, they're all the same thing. So if you hear hero, protagonist, point of view, character, whatever, they're all the same thing. Now, like I said, there has to be some fundamental flaw in your main character, something about themselves that requires change. Now, according to the conventions of storytelling, okay, these are the fundamentals. Once again, we want the main character to be oblivious to this particular flaw. Now, of course, they're going to come to realize it later in the story, okay? But we want the main character to either be completely oblivious to it or completely ignoring it. Like it's right there. If we think of dramatic irony, okay, the reader knows stuff that the character doesn't. This is dramatic irony. Okay. Now, when we look at types of need, okay, I want to kind of distinguish between types of need for a moment. We all have physical needs, okay, food, sleep, water, etc. Okay, we don't really need those to be dimensions in the story. I mean, unless your character is stranded in a desert and water is very important, okay. But for most of our stories, we're probably not going to be stranding characters in deserts. The psychological and the moral needs, these are far more important for good character building. Okay. Now, psychological, like I said, much better to build into a character, and a good psychological need will necessarily lead to a moral need. If we think of the notion of cause and effect, this will become more and more clear. Okay, I'll keep pointing to this idea of cause and effect in your stories because, excuse me, because what this does when you have good cause effect structure in a story, it actually makes the story feel more organic. Even though you are formalizing that relationship, when we read it, it makes it feel more organic. So let's say we take a character. Okay, I've made up a generic character called Jan. She's right here. Okay, she looks happy, but she's not. Okay, so she's lying to herself about being happy. Now, let's say that Jan has some psychological. We're going to go into backstory. Okay, we're going to try to build this character mentally before we even write a word down in the story itself. Okay, let's say she has some psychological damage from an abusive relationship with her father. Okay, that's a pretty standard It's almost cliche, but it's not cliche because, well, it happens all the time. Okay. This creates a certain need psychologically that she desires. That psychological need might be parental affection. It might be the need to avoid thinking about her father. Okay. She just wants to bury it. She doesn't want to face it. Okay. So that starts to create tensions in her psychological character. Now, let's say we take that psychological need. What kinds of moral needs or problems, really, can come from that? So maybe she, because of this psychological trauma, maybe she treats men in a hostile way. Maybe she sees them as merely means to her personal end. So she uses people, perhaps. I mean, like I said, we're just building a random character here in the story. Okay, so maybe it's just for sex, for money, for gifts, whatever, etc. Okay, the kind of material needs. She thinks that's what she really wants. We, the reader, know differently. Now, her psychological need causes this moral need. Okay, she eventually in the story will have to do one of two things when we get to the self-revelation: is to try to change that thing within herself to become a better person, or she tries to change and it ruins her. Okay, those are the basic story structures that we're looking for. Maybe, for example, maybe Jan grew up in a crime family. Okay, so her psychological normal is that crime is okay. Okay, because crime is what her father and mother did or used to provide for the kids. Okay, so now that upbringing, okay, that psychological need creates moral effects. Okay, here the moral effects would be her need, okay, her moral need to realize that crime is not okay, etc., etc. So you see that the psychological needs necessarily build the moral need. Okay, and these are all inherent to the character, usually based on their backstory and their current situation. Okay, now when we are building a character, remember that there are internal and external problems they face. That's just like us, right? An external problem would be your bills, for example, or going to school. Okay, not that I would label school as a problem, but you know what I mean. The psychological need, for example, of going to school would be, well, to get an education, to become a better person, you see. But these internal and external problems, okay, are very important to distinguish because we want our character's psychological and moral need to be internal. Okay. The external ones are important, but they're not as important for building a really good character. Okay, we all have bills to pay. We all have problems going on in life. Okay, so we want to internalize those aspects. Okay, now I dropped this down in here. I'll come back to those 7 here in a moment. When we're talking about psychological and moral dimensions, there's 2 basic ways that you can build this. Okay, when you're building your character, when you're working out your character sketch. Okay, identify your character's psychological weakness, and then from that, think about what kinds of immoral actions may result from this. Okay, so if Jan had abusive relationship with her father, what kind of immoral actions may result from that? So she uses people based on that, right? Now, using people in that way, simply as a means rather than as an end, right, is what I would call immoral, right? We're not supposed to use one another. That's not how people operate. And then we have to think about number 3 right here. What are the moral effects that this action will have for her character and those around her? You see that we have cause and effect. Okay, we have this psychological moral need, and it affects her decision making. It affects her actions out there in the world. Okay, so not just for her, but for other characters in the story as well. Okay, and that starts to create very good layers of conflict, layers of tension, and that's where a good story really starts to gain traction. Another way you can build this, it's kind of the opposite, is to take a virtue in the character and push it so far that it becomes a weakness. Okay, her her passion for this virtue, whatever it is, this becomes a moral blind side to her. So I mean, I just randomly I thought maybe she's so zealous about converting someone to her religion that she can't see what effects this might have. Okay, maybe, for example, maybe she is involved in crime. Okay, now we're kind of playing with this idea of virtue. Okay, we're kind of playing with this idea of virtue. So she's trying to corrupt maybe a friend, and she says, "Hey, come into this, deal with me. You'll make a ton of money. Then you'll be able to buy your mom that house." So you see that virtue trying to help, okay, becomes a kind of moral blindside. She's not seeing what kinds of effects this might have for herself and for people around her. Then number two, we have to figure out what are her values and what are the negative consequences, the effects of those values. Okay, so remember, cause effect, cause effect, cause effect. So to go back to this, so we've got weakness and need. We've established some kind of weakness, some kind of need, psychologically and morally for our character. Now, with desire is easy to confuse with need. Desire is not need in the same sense. Okay, desire in the story is the external part of the character's motivation. So here we have the internal-external divide. Okay, let's go back to Jan. Her need is to overcome the trauma of childhood in order to have a fulfilling life and relationship, to stop using people. Okay, her desire, number two, is perhaps to acquire, let's say, a bunch of material possessions, to land a good job, to finish grad school, to get married, to Mr. Right or whatever. Okay, desire is what the character wants in the story, not what she wants in life, and not the thing that has to change. So I want to make that distinction pretty clear here. Some people will kind of conflate these, and usually it makes the character a bit less dynamic. Now, we'll get into opponent a bit later when we talk about character and whatnot, but the opponent in a story, now there always has to be an opponent, okay? Now, the opponent doesn't have to be some evil character lurking in a dark alley waiting for the hero to walk by so they can jump out and fight. No. The opponent can be insecurity. It can be greed. It can be addiction. It can be jealousy. These all can be opponents, so long as the character isn't fully aware that they are a central issue at first. Okay? So the weakness, the need, can be a type of opponent, because the character is kind of wrestling with that. Now, by linking the opponent to the hero's needs and desires, you put them into direct conflict. Now, this is crucial in a story. There has to be direct conflict between the character and the opponent throughout the story in some way. Sorry, I just got a text from my sister. Now, conflict is central to building a good story. Remember back in Intro to Creative Writing, we called it agon. Okay, that idea of strife or conflict that comes from the Greek, where we get antagonist and protagonist. Okay, that agon comes in to those words etymologically. Think about it like this. What does your hero want? How can the opponent get directly in the way of that? Okay, that is how you build a good set of characters in your story. I'll talk more about this here in a minute. Next up, we have plan. This links organically to the desire and need and the opponent aspects of the story. Let's say that, Jan has weaknesses and needs, okay? She has certain desires, etc. There's an opponent standing in her way. What's she gonna do? How's she gonna beat the opponent? How's she gonna get married? How's she gonna, whatever. Okay. So the plan is basically the story itself. Okay. Let's say that Jan, and I'm sorry to make her sound like such a terrible person, but usually in our stories, we want the characters to be kind of terrible. We don't want them to be purely virtuous and purely good because nobody's that way. Nobody's purely virtuous and nobody's purely good. Okay? We want our characters, as I've said before, to be defined by their flaws. So let's say that Jan plans to use her new boyfriend to land a cushy job where he works. Okay? So he says, "Oh, I can get you a job here," and she just plans to basically use this guy, make some money and then dump him or whatever. Okay. The opponent here, for example, in this scenario, could be that her ambitions are fueled by malice rather than an actual desire for this job. Okay. Or the opponent could be another person vying for that same job. Okay. Her plans, thus, are based on the weakness, need, desire, and opponent. How is she going to manage to try to get what she's going to get? Okay, that will inevitably lead to this idea of the battle. Now, this is inevitable. If your story doesn't have a battle of some sort, okay, then it's not working effectively as a story. Now, like I said, the battle here doesn't have to be like a sword fight or kung fu in a hallway or whatever. It can be a slow war of attrition. There can be small mini battles, okay, small arguments throughout the story, leading up to this ultimate showdown. Okay, the battle has to be there because without that, we have no self-revelation. Okay, the self-revelation after an intense, painful battle, the character has to confront herself. Okay. Now, what about the character's actions necessarily will change? What does she realize about herself based on her weaknesses and needs, desires, the opponent, the plan she made, which works or doesn't work? Okay. But ultimately, it has to lead to a self-revelation. Now, sometimes authors will play with this by having the character attempt to change, which then destroys them. That's also totally valid. In fact, that's kind of the story type I prefer. We don't want the self-revelation to be too obvious, to kind of hit us over the head. Okay? It has to be important, though, for the character. They have to come to that realization. But we don't want the narrator to begin to sermonize. Okay? And that's when Jan truly learned the value of love. The end. That it would be like a rom-com kind of ending. Okay, when we're writing literary fiction, we can't throw out the big meanings and the big reveals and the epiphanies too broadly. Okay, in terms of epiphany, there's a really beautiful story. I hope you've at least maybe heard of him, but it's by the character. It's by the author James Joyce, the Irish author. And it's from his book, it's the last story in his book, Dubliners. It's a really beautiful book. I consider it kind of his masterpiece, although most people are going to say it's Ulysses. But I want to read this. These are the last two paragraphs, spoiler alert, of this story. And the main character, Gabriel, realizes, and it's kind of a long story, he realizes and finally confronts, he has a self-revelation. He realizes and finally confronts the idea that his wife was once in love and romantically involved with somebody else very intensely. Okay? That he, for example, he realizes that she doesn't love him in that way. That's not as intense as that. Okay? And though they do care about each other, he also realizes, and this is the real self-revelation, that he could never love her or anyone that intensely. Okay? So I just want to read this out loud. It's just two paragraphs. It's a really beautiful bit of writing. And these are the last two paragraphs of the story. I will try to follow along with the text. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself toward any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness, he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a gray, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and, farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead. Now, if you'll remember back to intro where we were talking about just good paragraph building, right? We have really, just to point this out, okay, we have really good imagery here, okay? The tears gathering in eyes, partial darkness, he imagines this figure. We have good imagery. And it goes out into this kind of imagination world, okay? He's imagining all of this. He's kind of vaguely seeing into the dark as if peering upon all the dead kind of gathering, all these souls gathering. And then we have this nice little environmental marker. A few light taps upon the pane, something physical. So remember, we can't just stay in the mind and imagination the whole time. The real world is always there. And then we have this nice, this kind of panorama covering all of Ireland here. About the snow falling on everybody, the living and the dead. And just look at how beautiful the imagery is here. Look at how beautiful the rhythms of these sentences are, right? There's some alliteration, some consonants, some assonance going on in here, as we discussed in the poetry section from Intro to Creative Writing. Now, the epiphany, for example, here, the self-revelation, is negative in Gabriel's realization, okay? This guy, Michael Fury, that's his wife's ex-lover, her true love, okay? The epiphany in this part is negative precisely because the character realizes his own insufficiency. He realizes, of course, as we all know, that we all die, okay, but that the great loves that shape a human life, that seem most important, themselves are fleeting and ephemeral like the snow, and that he, the main character, has not even felt anything remotely like it, and therefore is himself more or less dead. He joins the dead in a sense, right? So Michael Fury here, in this sense, is almost more real than him because there was this passionate love that his wife still thinks about, that still bothers her. Like I said, even though they care about each other, there's not that passion, that true love between them. Okay. Now, the new equilibrium, to go back to what happens after self-revelation, you can go back up. It's number 7. So here, Gabriel's realization causes a new equilibrium. The snow symbolizes the blind and universal fact of death. It covers everyone, covers everything. His equilibrium is a sad one, not quite tragic, because he's not a tragic figure. Okay? Because, now it's sad because he knows he can't actually come to a true equilibrium. It's almost too late for him, right? A true equilibrium would be he realizes he's not quite capable of this kind of love, and he works at it. Okay, but because it's the end of the story and Joyce ends it here, we get this sense that, well, you know what? This is the end of Gabriel, right? It's this lack of self-equilibrium. Okay? When human beings, like you or me, are forced to realize things about themselves, we have the choice to change or not change. And that change, or its absence, has to have we have the choice to change or not change. It doesn't really have a giant consequence, usually, upon our lives. I might think, okay, I need to eat more vegetables. Okay, now, if I keep eating just meat, I'll end up with gout or something, I mean, in a ridiculous sense. But you see that it's not a huge change, right? It's not a thing of consequence, okay? But for your characters, it has to be a huge consequence. The new equilibrium, the self-realization, have to have giant sort of permanent impacts upon the character. They have to be positive or negative, and they must be permanent. Okay? When we are building a story, and I think I might have, where's my cursor? I'm pretty sure that I outlined this when we were kind of discussing narration and plot. But if we think of the character's story going like this, okay? Character is doing something, and they have to make a choice right here, some kind of choice. Now, it can be big or small, doesn't matter. They don't have to all be giant life choices, okay? Sometimes it's, do I get coffee or do I get tea? But that choice between coffee and tea leads the character onto a different path. And that has to have a consequence. That coffee and tea, although minor, has to have some kind of consequence, right? So maybe as she's sitting there drinking her tea, somebody walks up and says, hey, what kind of tea are you drinking? And that strikes up a conversation, and that leads to some other choice, right? And the character has to make one. Now, you see, what I'm talking about here with these choices, the character can't go back. The character can't go back past this threshold. This is the crossroads. They make the choice. Okay? Now, so they're having tea, and the guy says, oh, wow, delightful. Chamomile. Oh, I only drink Lapsang Souchong. And then all of a sudden he says, hey, by the way, would you like to go rob a bank with me? Now, most of us would say, no thanks. Now, maybe our character says, yes. Okay, now that's a ridiculous choice, I know, but what I'm trying to do is show you can't take it back. Okay, so now they go up to the bank. So they're in the bank robbing people, and there's guns and everything. And the security guard pulls out a gun. Okay, security guard pulls out a gun. Now she has two choices: shoot him or not shoot him. Okay, if she doesn't shoot him, the gun has to go off. Maybe her friend dies. Okay. If she does shoot him, now she's a murderer. Okay, and so you see that it's all these set of consequences that because these are thresholds, okay? Because these are thresholds, the character can't take them back. You and I, in our daily lives, right, if we make a mistake, we can usually apologize for those. We can usually take them back, right? But in a character, the way that it's structured in fiction is that the character makes choices that set up a series of consequences that the character cannot take back. Okay? Sometimes they're big, sometimes they're small, but this is what makes the story feel more and more organic. Okay? And if you go and actually look at most stories that are good, you'll see this exact same setup. Even if the character, let's say she let's say she cheats on her husband or something. Okay, so to draw that out, right? Character going through, cheat or not cheat on husband. She chooses cheat. Okay, now that leads her to new set of crossroads. Does she tell her husband or not? Okay, so she decides, okay, I'm not going to tell him. That leads to, obviously, him finding out. And then she can apologize or not apologize. Okay, so let's say she chooses to apologize. Even her apology can't take back the initial choice to cheat on him, you see. So this is what I mean, that these branching decisions, these crossroads are things that the characters don't get back because there's an impediment in the story that exists in a way that doesn't exist in the real world. Okay, so fiction is a stylized version of reality. Okay, this makes the story feel more organic, but it's kind of artificially placed on the story in fiction, but it's simply how stories function. Okay, so I want you to think of this idea of cause and effect, right? Now, when we're talking about other characters, so we've looked at what makes a good character, how to build that sort of. Well, what about under other characters? Okay, well, you have to have a good understanding of Jan, right? Because she's your main character. But you also have to have other characters in the story. Nobody exists by themselves in fiction. Okay, even what's that Tom Hanks movie, Castaway, where he's like alone on an island. He has that volleyball friend of his, right? The Wilson is what it's called, and that's a character, right? The island itself in that situation is also kind of a character. The island is the main opponent in that sense. Okay. So if we look at this setup, this will help you to understand characters and character types. So obviously we have our hero. Okay, and remember, like when I say hero, I don't mean they have to be virtuous. It just means our main character. Jan, as we've discussed earlier, she's not virtuous. She likes to use people. Okay, that makes her psychologically more interesting. In terms of the opponents, now if we're writing something like a comic book, okay, if we think of superhero versus supervillain, okay, we have this kind of oppositional strategy going on. It's much more clear. Okay. The hero, right, has to bounce off of these other characters. The hero has to interact and engage with them. Otherwise, the characters probably should not be in the story. And this is actually kind of a later development that you'll see in the drafting of your own stories, but you might have a character in there that you realize later is completely pointless. Like you don't need her or you don't need him. Okay. Okay, think of it like this. We have our hero, our main opponent. We can have a second and third opponent. Now, these aren't always directly oppositional. It's not like, Superman versus, I actually can't remember Superman's opponents. I know it's Lex Luthor, and then, whomever. Okay, you get the point. These are secondary characters that might be in partial conflict with Jan, okay, for their own reasons. So as I said here, could be her mother, right? That boy's no good for you. I don't see why you want to marry him. Could be her friends, right? No, Jan, you can't marry Gary because, whatever, right? Or maybe an ex who's trying to get back with her. It's just Peter, I think, is my ex character here. So he's trying to, right, get back together with her. And that opponent here is it's all about strife. It's all about conflict. It's not that he's going to fight her or something, okay? Or even necessarily fight Gary, okay? This is about setting up character structure in terms of potential conflict, okay? We have the fake ally opponent. Now, this means somebody who seems like a friend but is really a secret enemy. We have the fake opponent ally, somebody who seems like an enemy but is actually a friend. And then we have our subplot characters. Okay. By thinking of our character as surrounded by people who want different things, we're setting up all kinds of potential conflict. And like I said, I don't mean fighting. Okay. It just means opposing. Because we all want something, right? And even in a marriage or a relationship or family, right? You all might kind of generically want the same thing. It's just the means by which you achieve those goals usually differ, okay? So if we think of like a love plot, like I say here, Gary is not the ally. In a love plot, the love interest, okay? So if Gary is Jan's love interest, he's the main opponent. That's why I wrote MO down here, main opponent, okay? So they both want the same thing, right, to get married, so to speak, or whatever. But she's manipulative. He is not aware of that just yet, okay? So it's about different motivations, okay? Like I said, a second opponent could be Gary's mother, for example, not Jan's mother, but Gary's mother. So remember, we have our point of view character, right? But Gary's mother comes to visit. They're living together. Everything seems fine. And Gary's mother comes for the week. And so now we have our in-laws visiting. Always fun. I'll say no more in case my wife hears me. Now, a fake ally opponent, for example, I want to show you how this works. Okay. A fake ally opponent might be a character, I just call her Bernice, who maybe has a crush on Jan. So she's friendly to Jan and pretends like, oh, blah, blah, blah. But her motivations are to try to ruin her relationship with Gary. So she's a fake ally opponent. Okay? Fake opponent ally, right? Could be, it could be anybody. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. These are just things that you build into the story. Oh, sorry. Bernice could also be a fake opponent ally. That was my point here. That she does have a crush on Jan and is kind of hostile toward Jan because, well, why can't Jan just see what Bernice is thinking and fall in love with her, right? So that sets up a kind of tension between those characters. But maybe later in the story, she helps the marriage or helps the wedding or helps Gary or whatever in some way. So she's a fake opponent ally. Like I said, subplot characters, they're just the filler bodies that populate margins of the story. A waiter, guy at a cash register, lady driving a car, etc. There are characters that might show up for a moment or two, but then they're gone. They are important. Your subplot characters are important because they help make the world feel more or less like the world. Okay? So think of when you're setting up your characters and the structures of your character relationships, think of them in these terms. Okay? These are the basic terms that we would use. Now, here's a couple more tips. First, make your character interesting. I cannot stress how important this one is because very often people forget to make their character interesting. And I don't mean that they have to be, she was the most beautiful girl in the world, was super smart, had 4 PhDs, and taught at Harvard. Okay, that's interesting, but that seems a little excessive, right? People can be interesting simply for who they are. Now, number 2, allow your audience to identify with that character. Okay? By identifying with the character, I mean this. They have to be believable. They have to have a human flaw or maybe a couple decent characteristics that allows us to relate to them. If Jan is incredibly wealthy, most of us can't relate to that. Most of us aren't fantastically wealthy. But if she's wealthy and fundamentally unhappy, we can at least understand that last psychological part. So, like I said, wealth would be an external quality, whereas being unhappy, that's internal. Okay. Number three, we want to empathize with the character, not sympathize. Okay. Don't make your character, your hero, too likable. You know, you can make them somewhat likable, but I mean, have you ever met somebody who went out of their way to just constantly be agreeable with you? Just everything you say, like, oh yeah, yeah, that's great. Oh, you're so wonderful. Oh, I love your spaghetti. Oh yeah. If somebody is trying to be too likable, very clearly there's something wrong with them, right? It's not that we have to go through life being constantly agreeable or disagreeable, but when people are too likable, that people have an innate kind of distrust of that. Okay. Like I said earlier, number four, give your character a moral and psychological need. It actually should read psychological and moral need, okay? Because the psychological leads to the moral. Number five, like we talked about with self-revelation and new equilibrium, have the character change in a serious and important way. As I write here, if the character only realizes that she prefers Nikes over Reeboks by the end of the story, you're not building an interesting character. Okay? Change is internal, and for the character, must be eternal. Okay? Just think back to that passage we read from Joyce earlier about this character looking out and contemplating, you know, his wife was in love with somebody else at one point. And at the time that that was written, okay, just to put this in context, like in the modern world, that's not really that big of a deal, right? We wouldn't say, you can only love me and all, you know, that's ridiculous, right? We don't think in those ways anymore. Back then, that would have been quite scandalous, okay? The wife basically in that story is just keeping that story secret. Okay, she's hiding that from her husband because it's a minor scandal at that time, and so that revelation is very shocking to him. Okay, so if we're thinking about change, here are a couple change patterns to think about for your character. Okay, that can maybe just help you think about some of the fundamentals, some of the important types of change. So we can go from child to adult. Now, I don't mean like the story has to cover the point from when she's 10 until 30. What I mean is that she could be psychologically childish, right? And then she comes to maturity in that moment of self-realization. Okay, so child to adult, if we're writing young adult literature, sure, it's child to adult. It's called a maturation plot. For our stories, since we're not writing about kids, okay, don't write about children, write about adults, they're more interesting. It's this idea of immaturity to maturity. Okay, that's what child to adult would mean. It could be adult to leader, right? Somebody realizes some hidden characteristic inside of them. Okay, if we think of what's a good example of this that you might have seen, Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead. Okay, he goes from adult, you know, he's a father and a cop. Okay, but he becomes a leader in a way that he wasn't before. Okay, so that's part of, and that changes him, right? Because he all of a sudden has this gigantic responsibility on him that extends past his immediate family. Okay, he is called upon to lead these people, etc. Okay, it could be cynic to participant, somebody who is skeptical. Okay, now this can work in both ways. Okay, let's say we have somebody who is, let's go cynic to participant, somebody who is without religious faith becomes, in the course of the story, a person of faith. Now, we can reverse that too. Okay? It could be participant to non-participant, we might say. I believed in God or whatever, and then suddenly all, you know, blah, 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 blah. Self-realization, new equilibrium, right? I realized, you know, the universe is a vast and empty void. Okay? So it could be cynic to participant or participant to non-participant. Okay. Now you see that could be a positive or a negative one. Okay. Adult to leader, child to adult, those are usually positive. Leader to tyrant is usually pretty negative. Okay. Because there we have somebody, and actually The Walking Dead does this in certain points. Rick becomes a tyrant, because it's not that the power goes to his head, it's just that, well, he believes that he's always right and he's always making the right decisions and he's not listening to anybody else. So thereby he becomes more or less a tyrant, forcing other people, right, to follow him or else. Okay. So you can have, and that's a long series. Okay. In a short story, you don't really want to have more than one of these major changes. Okay. It's not going to be Jan goes from child to adult, adult to leader, cynic to participant. No, it's one of these. Okay, just choose one for the story. So leader to tyrant's pretty obvious. Leader to visionary is similar, where the leader basically becomes something more than just a leader. Okay, a visionary in this sense. Think about somebody like Martin Luther King, right? He was a amazing leader, right, and pastor and speaker, but because of the kinds of change that he was trying to enact in the United States, he really did become a visionary. Something more than just a leader. And in his case, basically the figurehead of the civil rights movement in America. So it's not just that he was a leader, which he was clearly, but he was also a visionary. Okay, so that's what the leader to visionary more or less means. Metamorphosis. This is more about kind of physical change, and it could be depending on the kind of story you're telling. If we're doing science fiction, it could be literally physical metamorphosis. There's a good movie. I think it was directed by David Cronenberg. It's a remake of a movie from the 50s. This was made, I think, in the 80s. It's called The Fly, and I think it's Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis, I think, are the main actors in it. But anyway, the scientist, he's doing some work on genetics, and also, he's not doing genetics. He's doing teleportation, right? So trying to teleport matter from one point to another. Okay, so at one point, right, he gets in the machine and he's going to teleport himself, but what he doesn't notice is there's a fly inside the machine with him. So when it teleports him, right, it kind of combines him with the fly. So he starts to develop these fly-like qualities. It's actually a pretty grotesque. The visual effects are pretty grotesque in it. And so he literally changes physically. But metamorphosis is about physical change. So if we think of, let's think if we're talking like a young adult novel, this idea of the physical change through puberty, for example, that children go through before they become adults. Okay, that is a metamorphosis plot. That's a metamorphosis change, okay, regarding a character. We're not writing young adult stories for this class. We're trying to write literary fiction. Okay, but these are important changes that all human beings go through. Okay, so that's why I want you to think of these change patterns and try to just focus on one for your stories. Okay, in 20 to 25 pages, you're not going to be able to cover much more than one of these anyway. Now, if you'll remember back to Intro to Creative Writing, some of these change patterns are very similar to plot structures that we looked at. Now, plot is something I'll talk about here in a little bit, not in this lecture, but in a different one. Plots are relatively limited in structure because plot, just like these change patterns, reflect the range of human experience, which is also relatively limited, is it not? If we go in and we dissect things like human motivation, it really comes down to just a few things that truly motivate human beings, right? Some of these are good, some of these are bad. Things like desire, sex, material wealth, family, jealousy, anger, patriotism, sacrifice, right? Parenthood. All of these things are definite motivators in human life, but there's not an infinite list of them. So if you're looking at these lists and you're saying, well, that seems too formulaic, well, please remember that the range of human experience, the range of human emotions is itself rather limited. It's not to say that it's boring, right? Not to say that it's boring, but rather that it is a limited set of qualities that we can draw upon as writers. So don't think that you have to reinvent the wheel when you're writing a short story. No, these are the conventions by which stories become better because they set up character change in a dramatic and meaningful way. Okay? That character change comes suddenly. It can come as a surprise to the character as well. Okay? So in that sense, when the change happens, the hero has been lying to themselves about the justifications of their actions. Okay? Just like us, we all lie to ourselves all the time. Sometimes, though, the lies that we tell ourselves and others are detrimental to our overall well-being. Okay, the setup that this is the setup that I want you to try to aim for in writing or revising your stories for this class for this semester. Okay, lacking these elements, okay, your stories might not be as dynamic, might not be as interesting, might not be as good as they potentially could be. So this covers character. I think I have a couple more on structure, and then I want to do one on plot, as it'll be a little bit of a rehash from intro, and then I wanted to cover some aspects of moral argument. Okay, we're not going to talk about like world building and symbolism in this class because those I'm leaving for the next stage of the fiction classes, which is advanced creative writing in fiction. So anyway, I hope this helps. Thank you.